everyone, and welcome to Core Module 3, the last module in this first phase of our PACT programme. And as before, we have a quote to set the tone for this module right from the beginning. Education is not a way to escape poverty, it is a way of fighting it. And this quote is from Julius Nyerere, who's a former president of Tanzania, a bit of a controversial figure for some, but he's also a former teacher, and we like this quote. Education may help some individuals to escape poverty, and we're told that over and over again, but we know that for many that is not the case. But giving young people the knowledge, skills and awareness to fight it, we believe working together can help lift everyone out of it. So with that thought, let's go over to Sandra for the module introduction.
Welcome back, everyone. We really are so happy that you're here today for the last module in this series, and we really appreciate that everyone has got so much on at the moment, and getting to the end of term, especially in these difficult circumstances, we know it's really taken a lot for you to come and join us today. So we particularly appreciate that. So we've gone for a very optimistic title with this module, Schools Against Poverty, the Art of the Possible. We feel that really chimes with the quote that Kate just shared with us there. So we'll just take a wee look at the session plan for today. Schools Against Poverty, the Art of the Possible. So once again today, we're confronting that elephant in the classroom. And we're looking at how we can join the dots to change things, looking at what we can do as schools and learning communities. So in the first half, we're looking at embedded schools and how we can achieve that. We're looking at culture change and sustainability, and we're checking back in on our human rights awareness. After the break, we're responding to feedback that we've had on the previous modules, which the feedback was asking for more time to share experiences, to discuss possibilities for the future. So we're giving most of the second half over to focused discussion groups, where you'll be able to meet with colleagues from your sector to talk about your experiences and plan ahead. So we're going to stop for the break about halfway through. The first half will be coming from us, and then it's over to you. And together we'll hopefully achieve these aims. So we're hoping to consolidate prior learning and your understanding on poverty and human rights. We're enhancing knowledge of a range of potential interventions, looking at pedagogy, classroom activities, poverty-related human rights education, and whole school anti-poverty policies. We also hope to facilitate the ongoing development of the PACT community and to support the development of your personal learning and your professional learning planning. So yeah, we're facing up again to that elephant in the classroom, poverty. So last time and the time before, we thought about these different faces of the elephant, representing both the different dangers and also the different approaches that we might take, from, you know, the kind of nice soft and fuzzy Elmer the elephant approaches to the, you know, to facing this real stampede from poverty in education. And we're going to really work today on thinking about what can we do about this, and what are our tools for recognising the elephant and seeing it in all its hiding places. So you'll remember that one of these possibilities was critical literacy. And those of you who were here last time will recognise this as a wee reminder. This is the Luke and Freebody model, looking at these 4 modes of literacy here. And just to pick up on the text user mode and the text analyst mode, what we're looking at here is critically analysing and transforming texts and understanding that texts are created for particular purposes. And therefore it's important for us to pass on to our students this understanding that no text is neutral. There's always an agenda behind it, and they'll represent particular views, and they might also silence particular views. And we can critique their designs and discourses together with students, or indeed with colleagues. And so we as teachers and our students are striving to become text analysts who understand that the texts embody values and interests of the creator, and also that text can position readers differently and both constrain and influence them. And so as teachers, we need to ask, what knowledge do students bring to the ways this text is designed to represent those views and interests? And we need to think about what explicit teaching in terms of language awareness that we need to impart to the students. So, as we know, it's quite often the most effective thing is to look at a worked example. So when we've been thinking about poverty and coming across various publications, and these could be government publications, or maybe they can be from groups who are genuinely trying to make things better for kids living in poverty, but we see an absence in these texts. Quite often, the absence of the word poverty. And Kate and I were both really taken aback when we were reading the report from the Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group on hunger. And we immediately saw that actually the word poverty is silenced here. And it made us think of a possible analogy here, you know, with pain and torture. And so we need to think, well, why is there hunger? You know, surely hunger is a symptom of poverty here. But it seems safer somehow to force the reader to concentrate on the food issue, because that's something that can be dealt with in a charitable way. For example, you know, children need good food 365 days a year from End Hunger UK. Of course they do, but actually, why don't we need to ask, why don't they have food 365 days a year? So, you know, when we're thinking about holiday hunger, which we need to see that connection with year-round poverty. And it's always quite a scary thing to bring in, you know, what's considered a contested or controversial issue to your classroom talk. And there are various ways to approach this in the classroom. So quite often it's helpful to use distancing language. If we're looking at some of these statements, we might ask the students or colleagues, if it's in a CPD setting, we might ask, what do people mean when we say that? And then show these outrageous statements that we've all looked at together before. We also find it's very helpful to build on shared beliefs and values, and that's something that schools have done a lot of really good work on recently in developing their own school values. So one example there might be we believe in compassion and protecting others from harm, and so of course we can connect our anti-poverty work as a school to that. And also, as you know, Kate and I both strongly believe in the power of metaphor. And the metaphor that you see represented here is another one from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And so in their work on reframing poverty, they're looking at how the social security system needs to provide an anchor to people. Because, you know, quite often, facts alone don't change how people think, and so we want to bring in metaphorical language and story, which we know anyway from all our work with young people is a really effective way to do this. And quite often, you know, we find ourselves again in one of these moments that we call our rainy day moments. And we were talking in a previous module about, you know, how we can have this almost forced or false balance where, you know, people are saying weigh up the two sides, weigh up the two sides. And we think of things like when Donald Trump was looking at the attacks on anti-fascist protesters. There were fascists on the streets. And yet Trump said, well, you know, there are faults on both sides. I mean, where's the reality? So this is where we look out and we see the downpour here. And we know that there is a reality, and we need to think about how does this translate into the classroom. So I'll pass you back to Kate now.
Thank you, Sandra. So, teaching human rights, all hell will break loose. I should start by saying that we don't think all hell will break loose, so don't worry about that. The title is actually taken from a study by Cassidy, Brunner and Webster, a Scottish study in 2014, which I've referred to before. And the comment, teaching human rights, all hell will break loose, comes from one of the participants. So I want to reassure you that we don't anticipate that happening. But on the other hand, for some people, this is a controversial issue, and we think that it's only right and proper that we equip you with some of the tools you may need to deal with that. So let me tell you a wee bit more about that study that I've referred to before. So it was done through talking to a group of student teachers in Scotland about their fears and concerns about teaching human rights. And as I said, this is in 2014, so some things may be similar, some things may have changed, but let me read you some quotes. This is taken direct from the study itself, and at times they are quoting other studies, so obviously the references to the authors will be in the resource pack when you get that. So, for some, the fears arise out of lack of knowledge, and this might easily be addressed through a programme of education, either in the initial stages of teacher education while at university, or in continuing professional development for working teachers. Obviously what we're doing here today. For others, however, the potential reaction from children's parents in teaching their children about rights is what causes anxiety, with the suggestion that parents might complain because they disagree with what is being taught. And they say that this is expressed across two dimensions: what to teach and how to teach it. And they go on to identify specific tensions in teaching HRE that were identified by participants in three areas: human rights versus children's rights, we've talked about that quite extensively in these modules. Fear of parents' reactions to teaching human rights topics, we'll talk a wee bit more about that, and perceptions among students that teaching human rights is qualitatively different from teaching other subjects. And again, we have argued in these modules that that is certainly the case, and are presenting human rights education as very much an underpinning or an overarching way of looking at things, however you want to look at it, that really potentially acts to enhance all our educational frameworks and is a lens through which we can view our work. They then go on to quote another study that suggests that, quote, that by viewing children as humans and therefore considering human rights more fully, this will benefit the expansion of the whole range of children's rights. And we've certainly followed up on that thread and are very much of that opinion. They go on to quote another study and say that it introduces an interesting notion excuse me, that through teaching human rights, some teachers changed. She describes the transformative processes that these teachers go through in terms of their personal and professional lives. And there is, she says, again quoting directly, a knock-on effect of their being more knowledgeable and confident in the area of human rights, and that this impacts upon those around them beyond the immediate sphere of the school. She goes on to say that this is further borne out by other studies who investigated the impact of learning about human rights on university students. And the results showed clearly that after only a few seminars, there were changes in the students in terms of the attitudes to human rights, as well as the knowledge they had gained as a result. And that this in turn led to greater confidence in dealing with human rights issues. They go on to say, finally, this information in itself is helpful in considering the impact there may be on children learning about human rights, but perhaps more importantly in the first instance, that in order to address teachers' fears of human rights education, they themselves may benefit from a programme of studying human rights. So really just wanted to quote you from this earlier study to help inform obviously some of the approaches that we take here, which is obviously that has been part of the evidence base, but along with a great many other things. And as a human rights scholar, obviously I brought my own research to this as well. So let's look a wee bit more about understanding poverty in human rights education. And building on the critical literacy awareness that Sandra's been talking about, we want to draw your attention to some particular issues about teaching HRE, particularly poverty-related HRE, because there are particular issues there, and that's where our focus is, obviously. And we're using some quotes just to introduce and highlight some important points. So the first one here, just to reiterate, a right is not what someone gives you, it's what no one can take from you. And that human rights education is much more than a license in schools or a thing for the day. It is a process to equip people with the tools they need to live lives of security and dignity. And that obviously is just a quote to consolidate and remind you that we've been making the point over and over again that the Convention on the Rights of the Child, important though it is, does not adequately serve our young people in terms of understanding what's happening in their communities and in terms of becoming adults themselves and what happens to those rights then. So the next one is from Giroux, who most of you will be familiar with, and he reiterates that point again, that as teachers we must be aware of the effects and implications of our own human rights stories. And again, an emphasis there obviously in stories I'd like to draw out, because again, to consolidate but the importance of narrative. He goes on to say, as human rights educators, furthermore, we must recognise our own cultural and political baggage and be ethically and politically accountable for the stories we produce, the claims that we make upon public memory, and the images of the future we deem legitimate. This quote was actually, there's a good article in a magazine called Radical Teacher, and again, we'll give you a link to that for those who are interested in checking that out. And they say, in commenting this, that as teachers we must be aware of bringing our own versions of human rights stories and the potential that such stories have. So just recapping on that, because we've certainly been talking a lot about that in these modules. So our next quote from another Secretary General of the UN, as well as Kofi Annan, says, freedom for fear could be said to sum up the whole philosophy of human rights. And in actual fact, that's a quote that we in PACT very much agree with. It's referring back to a famous speech that was made by the US President Roosevelt when he talked about 4 freedoms. And really, I just wanted to make the point that very often when people talk about human rights, they talk about the freedom to do something. Freedom of speech is a very obvious one, but they forget about the freedom from, and freedom from want and freedom from fear. They can all be summed up in freedom from fear. And the fear of all the human rights violations that are happening to people on a daily basis, and particularly in this case in relation to poverty. And freedom from fear is what we're hoping that we can help you and your colleagues create within a school setting, where we can't stop poverty, as we know, but we can shut the door firmly on it and create a situation where young people and children are not afraid of being stigmatised, are not afraid of being left out, are not afraid about somebody shouting at them for not having a pencil, and so on and so forth, and the other examples that we've given. And our last quote is from a prominent social justice journalist and political activist of the last century, who makes an important point. And we who have toiled for freedom's law, have we sought for freedom's soul? Have we learned at last that human rights is not a part but the whole? And I'd like that last part of that, I'd like you to hold that thought. So we're going to come back to that. But to recap some other important points here, human rights education itself is a human right. And thinking about using tools of critical literacy are really important in teaching about this in the classroom. And when you're preparing for this and actually reading human rights resources, apart from our own, if you're interested enough to be able to want to read more and to bring some resources into it, this is what you might find. When you read a lot of human rights materials, sometimes you'll wonder, where is the mention of poverty? And I quite often do a keyword search, and if you actually, it's quite astounding that so many things that talk about human rights don't mention the word poverty. And once you've got the hang of the human rights language, you might start wondering, where are the economic, social and cultural rights? You might even look for that phrase, or ESC rights for short. And again, many people actually talk about human rights as if they are actually, they're talking about part of the human rights spectrum, even though they refer to human rights. So I'll talk about that in a second. You might still also find that in human rights materials that poverty is still referred to, if it is there, as being somewhere else, as being in some other country that's not at a great stage of development as we are, supposedly. And where it is included domestically, and that is increasing, I do have to say, but still a problem, what happens often is there's a passing mention of poverty stats of one sort or another, and it feels like a kind of tokenistic mention. So we've talked about before of bewaring of what we're calling poverty synecdoche. Now, I didn't use that word before. I didn't know the word until Sandra, as an English teacher, introduced me to it, and I was searching for a word that actually explained what synecdoche means. So for those who haven't come across it, it's when an actual something is used in language that is actually a whole of something, a part of something rather, but it is used to represent the whole, or whether you're presenting something as the whole of something and in actual fact it's just a part of something. So examples of that in relation to poverty synecdoche could be when we talk about child poverty. In actual fact, children are not isolated from their parents, and we know that the best way of lifting kids out of poverty is to lift their parents out of poverty. So we're really talking about poverty there. And similarly with fuel poverty or food poverty, we're actually talking about poverty. If people have enough money to live on, then they won't be in fuel poverty or in food poverty. And so just as we beware of poverty synecdoche, let's beware of human rights synecdoche, as I was saying. So beware of the marginalisation or downgrading of human rights in the ways I've described, and in other ways that, now that you're aware of it, you probably will be able to pick up. I would say beware of narrow interpretations of human rights. For example, it's very common for people to talk about human rights when what they actually mean is human rights law. And I'll give you a quick example of that. I turned on the telly a few years ago on International Human Rights Day, which was yesterday, by the way, so I should have probably opened by wishing you all a happy International Human Rights Day for yesterday. But on this particular occasion, I was just in time to see a very prominent Scottish lawyer say, "I'm not convinced that food is a human right." Now, I don't know if you're as shocked by that as I was. And I should say that this is now an elected member in our parliament, which is obviously of concern. But I had to puzzle over that, and I came to the conclusion that the only way he could actually really, believe that is that if he thought, as a lawyer, that human rights were only what was enshrined in human rights law. And in which case, if that was the case, then he had a point. But many of us are in the opposite camp of human rights, in that we believe that human rights exist outside human rights law, and actually human rights law is just a way to codify what is already there, and very often it gets codified when people react and retaliate against there being human rights violations. So to give a wee example of that in a kind of reverse synecdoche, just as women have to constantly think about whether we're included in discussions that use the words man or mankind and so on, and increasingly whether Scotland is included when we hear talk of the UK, sometimes we have to check that. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. We often need to check if ESC rights are included when talk is of human rights. And equally, beware of cherry-picking rights. Rights are indivisible. One depends upon the other, depends upon the other, but depends upon the other. And the most obvious example we would argue here in PACT is of equality. Now, equality is a human right, but it is constantly talked about as if somehow that is the sum of human rights. And let me give you another example there. If you are in receipt of benefits, and if you're in receipt of the £70 odd a week, for example, that a single person is given to live on in this country, whatever community you come from, whether you come from a BAME community, whether you're a person with disabilities, whether you're coming from all the other communities that have systematic discrimination against them. In this situation, you're all being treated equally, because you're all being treated equally badly. And so without a human rights floor, equality in its own is not enough, because it depends upon the realisation of human rights for it to be meaningful. So just very briefly, sort of obviously pointing out that the UK government and the Scottish government are quickly and increasingly divergent paths on human rights. The Human Rights Act, as we know, is under attack from the UK government and has been for quite some time, and which was pointed out by the then Attorney General, we would be the first country in the world to actually repeal a piece of human rights legislation. I, as a human rights researcher, was told constantly that human rights are toxic down south. We have a lot of good things going on in Scotland, but it's not perfect. I'm not saying it is, but we do have a Scottish National Action Plan, and to give some examples, the new social security system has an explicit human rights base. And lastly, the new economic recovery plan, which I was just reading yesterday, calls for the setting up of a centre of expertise in human rights and so on. So there's lots of things going there. And as well, our national performance framework includes human rights. So let's just move on a wee bit and just remind ourselves of the particular, a couple of foundational documents that we had highlighted before about human rights education. So first of all, the World Programme in Human Rights Education. We've given you links to that in the previous PACT, and we'll remind you of that again in the PACT that's coming out. The current focus there is on youth, so for our purposes that is very timely. But a reminder, looking at the next document, if you only take one thing away about human rights education, hoping you won't, but if you only take one thing, then it's about what is declared here in Article 2, the fundamental and now widely accepted principles that human rights education encompasses education about human rights. You need to know about them in order to claim them, through human rights, which in schools we should already be doing, and for human rights, and which they define as purposeful teaching and education to enable people of all ages to know their human rights and, crucially, to be able to demand and claim them. So before we move on to our next part, let's again just briefly revisit the human rights myths that we talked about, and to really to ask, are we, as teachers and education professionals, are we immune to these? We are human beings, we're all the products of our society. So just really doing a wee bit of asking you to do a wee bit of checking for yourself, to take a moment and to read and think about these if you want to bring them all in, please, Sandra. And there are, of course, others. And we're interested if anyone wants to ask a question at this point, or even to put your thoughts in the chat. So let's move on then to the next topic within this section, and you won't be surprised to find that we're saying once again, don't skip class. So in developing a whole school anti-poverty culture, obviously this is something that we need to bear in mind. It's not a fashionable word at the moment, but I hope that you would agree it's still very relevant and meaningful, particularly for looking at poverty and human rights. So that's the other elephant in the classroom, really. They're non-identical twins, but they are twins, but obviously they don't totally overlap. So just to remind you of a few things that we talked about before, again for the interest of consolidation and reflection. We talked in the last module a bit about cultural capital. We're referring back now to the Pattern Merchant poem, and I hope that for those of you for whom the sound was a bit of a difficulty at the time have had a chance to look at that, because if not, I would really recommend it. It's really very good, and there are lots of nuances between what this young person in this poem was saying with the expectations of teachers in the wider society based on how they looked, basically, and how they talked, and perceiving them as being working class, and actually the reality of their interests.
So some of you may already be familiar with the work of Peggy Mcintosh, and her work originally centred around privilege and this invisible weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and of course blank cheques. And Mcintosh at first applied this to white privilege and male privilege, and also went on to do some work on class privilege. And we're going to think today about how we can apply this work to class privilege using the concept of habitus. So I'm about to make some of us very uncomfortable, but that's absolutely okay. A little bit of discomfort happens when you learn and you grow, and we're all okay with that. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot at all, but I'm going to ask you to put yourselves in the mirror instead and have a think about some questions. I'm going to go through 3 sets of questions with you, and I want you to just think about any ways that that's applied to your own class position, whatever that might be. And then we're going to have a short discussion just in the group together about this, where you can give us comments either in person or in the chat. So let's see if any of this strikes a chord with anyone. I don't need to worry about learning the social customs of others. It's likely that my career and financial success will be attributed to my hard work. When I'm shopping, people usually call me sir or madam. And when I or my children are taught about history, people from my social class are represented in the books. So these are all fairly everyday things. Let's go a bit deeper. There are stores that market especially to people from my social class. Experts appearing on mass media are from my social class. When I watch TV or read the papers, I can see people of my own class represented well. I deserve my status because of my accomplishments. So let's go deeper still. Law enforcement officials will likely assume I'm a non-threatening person once they see me and hear me. Disclosure of my work and education may actually help law enforcement officials perceive me as being in the right or unbiased. My citizenship and immigration status will likely not be questioned, and my background will likely not be investigated because of my social class. And finally, I can deny social class privilege by asserting that all social classes are essentially the same. So let's have a quick discussion about that. If we go back to the first set of questions here, what are your thoughts on these? Who said she was a first generation immigrant into the middle class, and I am too, because, you know, for me, it's a lot of my life has been about learning the social customs of others, knowing instinctively that my own habitus was not the acceptable one.
So I see a comment there from Nicola who says, unfortunately, many people perhaps think like this.
I can come in as per usual.
Okay, great, Nicola.
I'm just going to say Sandra and I worked on the Peggy Mcintosh, and so kind of like worked on the privilege aspect, and I've been constantly, or in my own personal life, I need to keep constantly reminding myself to balance the privileges along with the other aspects that might not be that privileged. So I do have privileges, and that means that my experience as a BME person, woman, is not the same as another. So that's, I think for me, that was an important learning. And even looking at the curriculum now, I keep thinking there's so much critical literacy that we need to be looking at and thinking about in terms of the stories that we tell and how that might disempower some people. In terms of the BME community, I'm thinking about when we tell stories or talk about model immigrants or the good immigrants who've achieved so much, we are in a way not adding in the story the privilege that they might have had in terms of maybe class, able-bodied, male, even in a female coming from educated background. So yes, privilege is something that we need to think more and more about. So that's what I'm going to say. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's really useful. And the way it refers back to the quote that we had at the beginning, where we keep being told that education is the route out of poverty, but really, to pick up on your points, that's about holding people up as exceptions. And in a way, when we actually do that, we ignore the reality for most people. No, thanks very much, that's really useful.
you know, this last point here, I deserve my status because of my accomplishments, you know, this just makes me want to scream at the moment when we're looking at the Oxbridge educated politicians and so on who, you know, are really handling some issues very, very badly. And we think, yeah, that status, how was that earned, if indeed it was?
Okay, we have another quote here before we move on, Sandra, from M. McWhirter. I'm sorry, M. McWhirter, perhaps I don't know your first name, so apologies for that. It says, I've explored privilege through studying inclusion and recognise how difficult it can be to recognise your own privilege. Yep, indeed. And I would say, looking at it from a human rights-based approach as well, that obviously privilege is a relative term, and I totally agree with everything that's been said. Looking at it in another way, then the struggle here is for everyone to have the same human rights that those who feel privileged actually have, and to bring everybody up to that level so that we don't need to feel privileged because everyone has the same human rights. It's very far away at the moment, though. And Nicola's saying, agree with you, Sandra, exactly, Sandra, hereditary peerages is an example.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just actually reminded here, Kate, of the time we were about to speak to a police officer about something and were called, you know, madam and so on, and given a seat, and we saw another woman who was, you know, really suffering and having this terrible issue, and was spoken to so badly in front of us. And then, you know, that was a real kind of bringing it home for us, how these things can happen, even in the space of one conversation.
Indeed, I felt that was very much a them and us moment, and we were being seen as us by the police because they made certain judgments about us, and that woman was being seen as them. And that's a very good example. Let me just read out a couple more quotes before we move on, shall we? So from Lisa, she says, my experience is a bit of some and not the others. I have white / passing privilege, and part of my experience chimes with the sentiment of being first generation immigrant to lower middle class. But that hasn't always been the case, and the memory of that doesn't leave. My employment has been mostly in the precariat, and as an immigrant, I can be deported if there are any issues with the law. Absolutely. Thank you for that contribution, Lisa. That sounds really hard.
So I'm going to pass you back to Kate now for places, people and power.
Thank you, Sandra. So in this last module of Online Phase 1, where are we now? Places, people and power. This quote was taken from the official launch of the PACT project. Let me read it for you. Places, people and just power built this project. More places, people and different kinds of power have got us to where we are now, and more of each together are needed to get us to where we want to be. Our young people need us to do that. This might sound a bit like stating the obvious, but perhaps if I give you a wee bit of the context of this. Just to remind you, the PACT project originally came about through a discussion with Larry Flanagan and John Swinney at an international summit on the education profession. So places and people, and they're bringing them together in the right place at the right time, and the right people with the power to actually make these decisions, resulted in what we have here, what we're doing together, and the work in the community that we're building. More places, people and different kinds of power got us to where we are now. Obviously it took a lot of hard work and energy from the EIS and from our partners, from all the people who have supported us in our research and bringing together different voices and different perspectives. And obviously we're all here looking to find ways to exercise our own power insofar as we are able to make changes within our educational settings, and importantly for the young people who we want to support and to help make change for. So sometimes the obvious needs to be stated, and in a sense that's what we're doing here. We're looking to think about the places where our young people live and which our schools are situated, and of course the places are the schools themselves. The people who perhaps could help to build on the work that we're doing here and help to make change, the supportive people, the people for whom perhaps The arguments already are still having to be made, and the people, of course, who have the power to make change. But that is all of us. It's a question of degree. But let's look at that in a wee bit more detail. First of all, let's look at places. So we've made these images deliberately different to reflect our different communities. I do hope you can all see something that makes you feel that your community is included there, obviously. There's only so many images that you can put on the slide. The only one that we have of people there is of the young people in a forest that they're taking care of, and so it's reflecting the fact of how much they value that place. And really, this is what this slide is really about reminding you of what we've been talking about before, to consolidate this importance of value in place, and the communication from everyone in the school to our young people to encourage and support them to celebrate and to honour the place where they live. And for some, obviously, that may be more easy than for others, but it is so crucial in terms of both their experience in school and how they view themselves. And just very quickly, I had shared a little story from my own school days with Sandra, who encouraged me to think that it might be something that you all might want to hear. So going way back to primary school, a long time ago, but I still remember when children were laughing and teasing our teacher about where she lived, because they wanted to know a bit about her. And I still remember to this day, I must have been, I don't know, sort of mid-primary, just maybe going into late primary, the expression on her face, she looked out the window, it was another one of those rainy days, and said, "Far away from here," with an expression of utter contempt in her face. Now, I didn't have the words contempt then, but I knew what it was when I saw it. And the fact that that affected me, I loved my teacher, she was wonderful, I thought up to that point. And that affected me as a child, and as an adult, obviously, I can still remember it. So, and that was about the fact that she obviously, I felt, looked down on where I lived, where I grew up, where my family lived, my community, and by extension, she looked down on me and the other people in the class. So that's just an anecdote, but I think it is so important, particularly for young people who are living in areas of multiple deprivation, but who live in communities that very often can be very supportive and very warm and very caring, and that they have an opportunity to celebrate that, and that the school recognises that perhaps more than we're already doing. I know there's a lot going on, but as I hope you would agree, there is more than we can do. So one of these things in terms of thinking about that and thinking about a community audit is perhaps to do it slightly differently and to start with the young people themselves, and particularly during this time, as we talked about before, perhaps asking them what is going on in the community, asking them to ask their parents about what is going on in the community, what has got them through this time, or what isn't there and has, you know, that there's been an absence there. And we just wanted, again, in this time of consolidation, to refer you back to some of the examples we gave before, where we talked about the community in Castlemilk, who are still doing amazing things, posting regularly about that. As part of our research, another example is we visited Queen's Cross Housing Association in Glasgow, which is an example of a bigger organisation having very many good things going on in the community. In Leith, there is a wonderful community project that's taking a human rights based approach, particularly to housing. In Dundee, the Living Rent movement that started there again around housing has supported so many people and is now spreading across the country. And of course, in our research, we had lots more about what's going on in other communities, including our visit to Orkney, where we had something about what's going on in the islands community there. But it is important, if schools are doing this, and I would say this as a former community activist myself, that not only to have the usual suspects, important though they may be, and the ones who are actually normally given credibility. There are a lot of small organisations doing things that fall below the radar, and that's why perhaps it would be good to ask your young people to talk to their parents and to actually try and find a way to honour that, and when times are better, perhaps even to physically bring people into the school. So on that, let's move on to people. We've deliberately left that blank for you to fill in your own blanks. Do you see yourself there? Do you see others in your school or in your wider school community there? Who are the people who can support you and going forward with this? So carrying on, thinking about that and carrying on from what I was just saying, we know that middle class parents dominate many parents' associations. There's lots of research and evidencing that. And of course, naturally, one would say what happens there often reflects their interests. And remember the example that we gave about what happened to the ski trip exercise. So we're delighted to say that Education Scotland, for example, have some very useful resources in amongst their Engaging Parents resources about community engagement, and we're delighted to say that that is some powerful dot joining that is going on within education and within those kind of resources. For example, they include the Community Empowerment Act and the Community Engagement Standards in the resources, and we would commend that to you to perhaps, when you have time, whenever that might be, to have a wee look at that. But if we want to reach outside that usual group of parents, so how's about extending the thought experiment to include the cognitive and thinking about habitus as well, and actual communities where parents live? Do parents see themselves represented within the work of the school? How's about reaching out and inviting people in, not just as parents, but as community members, as neighbours and volunteers in the community? And obviously this is something to think about for when some kind of normality returns. But in the meantime, again, how's about we ask our young people to identify them, tell them what matters in their community, who is helping people's economic, social and cultural rights to be met, and thinking about, is it their responsibility or duty? Whose duty should it be? Thinking obviously, food bags is an obvious example. And thinking about all of that and having those kind of discussions with colleagues if possible, how would that affect our school improvement planning? So for the last in a little trilogy here, I'll pass you back to Sandra for power.
Thank you, Kate. So power, it might be helpful to think of a couple of definitions of power first of all. So the first being the ability or capacity to do something or act in a particular way, like the power of speech. And secondly, the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behaviour of others or a course of events. A political process that offers people power over their own lives, for example. And we can think again back to the power, threat and meaning framework, and how can we turn that into power, rights and meaning, power, solidarity and meaning. And you might want to reflect on that in the chat. If we look at the diagram on the left here, you know, everybody likes to do it as a wheel nowadays. If we look at some thoughts around community engagement here, looking at inclusion, support, planning, working together, and methods of communication that could bring a huge amount of power from the community into the school for mutual benefit. And that brings me to thoughts as well on school empowerment. And if we look at the wheel on the right here, you know, that's something we're already more familiar with, but I'm really interested in how empowerment is working in practice when it comes to anti-poverty work in schools. And I wonder if those of you in schools actually feel empowered to begin anti-poverty work. And for those of you in other settings, how empowered do you feel? So reflections in the chat are very, very welcome there. I just want to highlight as well, if we're looking at these concepts of power in and out of school, it's that idea that we just want to consolidate here about joining the dots. As Kate said, there are so many powerful pieces of work happening, but in isolation, they're much less powerful. So we need somebody to join the dots here, as we're seeing in so many other educational issues at the moment. So when joining the dots, it's easier to think about policy development and theories of change. So as always, looking at the Education Scotland materials here, we have the child at the centre, but we're looking in these spheres of influence at the parents, the school, the local community, and national factors as well. And I would recommend that you take a look at the Transforming Learning resource to give you some tools about how you can tap in to these resources within schools and communities. And I'd just like to highlight a quote here from Mel Ainscough in 2015 here. So within schools and communities they serve, there are untapped resources that can be mobilised in order to transform schools from places that do well for many children to places that can do well for them all. And we do have those resources within the communities. And as with any policy development or theory of change, we need also to look at the end goal here. The driving goal is not illusory short-term gains, but sustainable success. So back to Kate now.
Thank you, Sandra. So bearing in mind that idea of joining the dots, this is really just to sort of give you a kind of image, an image that many of you will be familiar with as teachers, and to relate it back to school. So just thinking first of all though, this is looking at the duties that are actually part of the state's duties to respect, to protect and to fulfil human rights. And again, if there's a take-home message, it's important that it's their responsibility to respect, to protect and to fulfil. So human rights creates rights and duties, and in the language of human rights, people, all of us, everyone, are the rights holders. States are the duty bearers. And the states, i.e. national governments, accept duties under international law, especially if they're signed up to the treaties. The treaty in particular that we're talking about in relation to poverty is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, although there are others, as I've said. But they have signed up to respect, to protect and to fulfil the human rights in those treaties. But we thought the traffic light system, familiar as it is to you as teachers, could also be adapted into schools in terms of looking at trying to create a whole school anti-poverty culture. So for example, to respect, which is about looking at obviously what existing rights are there, so to do a poverty and rights assessment and look out for unintended consequences, as we've talked before, as part of that. To protect, that's to stop other people interfering with those rights. In relation to school and anti-poverty work, you could be perhaps proactive, and as far as obviously you feel able and empowered to be, in asking for the above and asking for such an assessment, or talking to colleagues about the possibility of such an assessment, and in pointing out where you see poverty causing rights not to be met. And to fulfil, we know and we hope that schools can go beyond reaction and decision making in relation to poverty case by case. We know some of you already have some policies in place, but to fulfil, to think about how your school can devise, develop and sustain a rights-based anti-poverty policy, going beyond reaction and case-by-case decision making. And obviously I would remind you of what we had talked about before in relation to some of the work we've been doing with Bella Houston, and we hope and plan to develop that further before the end of the project. So policy, structure and processes, another trio that lends itself to that narrative, language and power and so on, and all of these are compatible with this kind of theories of change that Sandra has been discussing. So I'll pass you back to her now.
Thank you. So as we've mentioned in our previous sessions, the existing educational frameworks can be a really useful tool for those of us who want to bring anti-poverty work up the agenda in our schools. And when we're facing barriers or a lack of understanding from the hierarchy, shall we say, it can be really helpful for us to frame what might seem like outlandish, controversial ideas in these established structure. For example, using the Education Scotland improvement methodology that you'll all be familiar with from Higgios, or linking the anti-poverty work to health and well-being, literacy and numeracy outcomes, and of course in including your anti-poverty work in your own professional learning framework, your PRD. So back to Kate now for the next one.
Thank you, Sandra. So really this is, these will be familiar to you as the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course each of these are human rights, and really the idea of a human rights umbrella under which these all sit is just one that we just wanted to obviously to make explicit here. And of course you will see that the first goal is no poverty. But let's just move on so that we can get nearer to what we want to do next into the break. And so Sandra's just going to remind you of something.
So we've been talking about these bigger picture ideas so far in this session, and particularly over the last few slides. But it's important not to forget how much the everyday details can really make a difference to young people's education and young people's lives. So I'm just flagging up here once more the important work done by Child Poverty Action Group here. And this is just one example of many other really useful initiatives looking at the day-to-day experience, and we will provide links to those in the resource pack. Welcome back, everybody. I think you're back anyway. So we're going to do a bit of discussion in this second half because, you know, we've been quite pressured for time in the other modules. As you know, this was meant to be a much longer face-to-face experience over several sessions, so everything has been squeezed a wee bit, but we really recognise the value of giving you some discussion time. For the first 50 minutes, you are going to discuss your experiences so far of anti-poverty work in your school or your setting. And this can be quite an open discussion. You can give each other just a chance to talk to the rest of the group about what's happened for you, maybe while you've been doing this course, maybe before you even came to PACT, you know, maybe just the discussions you've had with colleagues recently in terms of poverty and anti-poverty work. And then, well, after about maybe 10 to 15 minutes, we'll send you a wee message in the groups and you can go on to looking to the future. Any opportunities for change that you see, any barriers that you want to overcome, and what's needed to make this happen.
Sharing information about in Edinburgh and what we try to poverty proof what we're doing with our children. But from my colleagues, I also heard about poverty in a more rural situation where families were needing to move on between schools to find work, I suppose on a seasonal basis. And from my other colleagues, they were talking about working in further education and really struggling with people that are doing vocational qualifications, trying to help them with their literacy, that, you know, those sets of skills that they're going to need when they leave college and try and enter the world of work.
And the first few weeks were really very difficult with behavioural issues, and I didn't really know how to navigate it. I was trying to implement rewards charts, and they have a restorative meeting system, but I wasn't feeling like I was getting anywhere, which was quite obvious because I didn't know the kids. So for 5 minutes trying to say, well, what do you think happened? We didn't have a relationship, so it was really difficult to try and figure out why the behavioural issues were happening. And then I started having conversations with guidance and support for learning, and realising that many of the pupils I was having the most difficulty with had really turbulent home lives, and that the fact that they were even in school was probably their biggest achievement of the day, and that we should value that, and then maybe not expect them to write an essay on poor laws or anything like that in the 1800s, and that they should actually just being there and having something small to do and is the bigger achievement there.
I was talking about how lockdowns made things very, very difficult in engaging with the outside community. I mean, we can't ask people to be coming into school at the moment, it's a nightmare. But also, you know, previous to lockdown, we were trying to engage with parents, and some of them were willing, but it's a real struggle to get other people to engage with schools, perhaps because they've had not a very nice experience of school themselves. But, you know, I was saying if we could try and change what our school looks like. We're working with Chai and Maximise to try and help families with housing, and we use our PEF money to fund that this year. but you know, we're not seeing so much of it because it's not happening in the building. So I'm not exactly sure how many people are benefiting from it at the moment. But you know, we all found out in our group that we're all sort of supporting learners that have got literacy issues or barriers to learning one way or another. And I was talking about how if we could have like social work in the school, if we could have ASL service in the school, if we could have an educational psychologist, different people that could help us with different issues that we're trying to, you know, to work more as a team. It just seems a little bit disjointed sometimes, trying to get the support that you need now in place before we can ever get to teaching. You know, the kids are not ready for learning. Some of the things that you hear from the kids are just shocking, and you wonder how they're coping so well with coming into school.
What people were talking about is the idea of one colleague was quite positive and had said that they're using PEF money to embed different experiences in the curriculum for children who require that, but not just stick to children who require PEF money, but all the ones that are on the background, are in the background, you know, that maybe don't fall into that category and are kind of overlooked. And she was quite positive of the work that they did, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the other thing we talked about was that was the attitudes to children. Another colleague had introduced emails and tried to raise awareness amongst the staff in the school about poverty, about the need to sort of support people going on or getting different experiences in school, not just necessarily trips, but just raise awareness. And she said she got 4 replies, but 4 replies is better than nobody thinking about it at all.
Mm. And you know, that could have planted the seed in a lot of people's heads, you know, even though they haven't replied yet. That could be those other people going from never having thought about it before.
Right, and the other thing was Josh was talking about, you know, how we put a lot of things in place and they're often tokenistic. You know, you've got your one-day assembly for something and then everybody forgets about it again. And I would agree with that. I would also agree with the fact that the view that I've got is that poverty often affects all children, but particularly those who have got support for learning and come into the additional support for needs departments. And for me, it's always been this idea, this patronising view of education, where as long as those children are happy and they've got a wee trip and we're making nice things at Christmas, then that's okay. Nobody thinks that they've got a right to a life like everybody else. Like, they should be able to develop skills and ideas, and they're not just getting their reading and their literacy up to date, but their vocabulary, so that they can engage in conversations when they leave school, and they can feel that they're build up their own self-esteem and enable them to take their own part in society. And I feel that's what's missing in education, and that's what this should really furnish us with, the ability to, I mean, it's quite a grandiose ideal, but I think that's what it should do to build these children up.
Yeah, yes, it is. And I think grandiose ideal, yes, but there is that thing though, if you don't have a vision and you don't have a dream, then you can't achieve it. And I think that even small steps on this journey are actually have the potential to make a difference. So don't be overwhelmed. We're trying to give you the big picture so that you can contextualise your own small steps. That's great. Thank you.
So thank you for that. Shall we go to one of the other groups now? We'll try out a primary group this time. Because I'm secondary, I always worry that I'll neglect primary groups. So please, someone from primary, would you like to come in and share either your whiteboard or just your thoughts, which are just as important?
I'll pick up on one point from Claire, which I loved. You said we need our schools to be different, and I absolutely, totally agree. And it's got to be different for each school that works for them. Not every school has got to be the same. And I was thinking about a school down south. Well, it's an early year centre who have managed to engage their community so much that it's that the parents are coming in, and the way they've done, one thing that seemed to me radical was the staff room is open for parents in the school. And I just thought, oh my goodness, why am I thinking that's radical? It's a staff room. So once the teachers are away into their classes, the parents have got, like if they want to stay over after they drop the kids, they can go in there, make a cup of tea, sit down, chat with each other. If a teacher comes in, they can say hello, hi. They can have a wee chat with themselves as well. And then, after 10, 15, whatever minutes, they go away. But they know that the staff room is open to them in the morning and they can just come in. So that just, to me, it was just like, wow, that the element of trust, the element of open doors, the element you're part of the community. You come in and you sit with us. And if you come in while we're sitting there, that's fine. Here's a chair, grab a chair, sit down, have a cup of tea. It's all, and that's why the school has been so successful in engaging with the parents. And Claire, they do have somebody from social work, and they have these surgeries as well, but parents say themselves what they would like to hear about, and they get that support. So yes, we need to look at the schools in a different way now.
I'm just looking at Lisa's comment here as well, about barriers. That one of the barriers they spoke about was having policies developed by those in power, making decisions from their points of view and not thinking how it impacts those out with the experience, and the slogan in disability activism, nothing about us without us. And that reminds me of the PTC, Kate.
Yeah, the Poverty Truth Community.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Kate, that, I was just saying to Sandra, I went on to the EIS PACT page where they've got all the resources, and I just feel that the recording is so valuable, because I could just go back and go and listen to different sections and recall and remember the discussion. So I think although face-to-face is really good, but there's some positives for this as well, that we can now go back and I can go back and revisit some of the learning again, I don't have to hold it all in my head.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. We really, really appreciate that. And keep in touch with us. We'll be in touch with you shortly.
So thank you very much. It's actually been a joy and a pleasure to do these sessions with you. And we are planning, I should have said, to do another session before we leave, hopefully bring everyone together to talk about how our community goes forward again.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.